Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you. Welcome to the 23rd webinar in our SSHRC-funded LEMDO webinar series. The topic for today is releasing your anthology. This is the editorial part of our month, and we'll be following up in 2 weeks with the technical side of things. I'd like to begin in a good way by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wet'suwet'en peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Just to introduce myself, I'm Janelle Jenstad. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a professor of English at the University of Victoria. I'm also the conceptor and director of LEMDO, the academic director of the Humanities Computing and Media Center, and the co-coordinating editor of Digital Renaissance Editions, the Moemel Mayoral Shows, and the new Internet Shakespeare editions. So our plan for today is as follows. You will understand why LEMDO makes periodic static releases. You will understand the concept of archival URLs. You'll have a sense of a timeline for the pre-freeze and freeze periods leading up to your first and subsequent anthology releases. You will also know what release notes are for and how to write them. And finally, you'll be able to decide when and how to publish the PDF and print-on-demand version of your edition. You're welcome to ask questions as we go or make comments. Navara Holden, the LEMDO project manager, is here and will be monitoring the chat to make sure that I see any questions or comments, or we'll have some time at the end of the webinar for questions and open discussion. What's not on the agenda for today, I won't be talking about the classroom anthology today. After all, we'll have a webinar on teaching with LEMDO at some point in the summer. The webinar series has been so successful that we'd like to keep doing the occasional webinar after the formal series is over. I won't talk about how to include an edition in your anthology because Navarro will be covering that in 2 weeks. And I won't talk about how to exclude or include selected parts of an edition. Likewise, Navarro will be talking about that in 2 weeks. But I'd like to talk first about the release model. Not every website does this, but I think it's important that everyone understands how we publish materials and why we do it the way we do it. So it has been traditional with a lot of websites to go with a rolling release model. The idea being that, because we can correct something today, we should publish that correction today. The rolling release model is not a great model for digital products. It has some serious consequences for our credibility when a website is constantly changing. It also means that people don't feel confident in citing it because they don't know what exactly they're citing. It's worth remembering that we're not a newspaper that needs to be constantly updating. We're not a government website. We're not Amazon. We're not trying to sell anything. So we've moved towards a periodic release model, which is a lot like the initial and then subsequent publication of editions of a book. We've gone back to a book-like release model. So here are some of the hallmarks of the periodic release. And what I'm giving you here are principles from the Endings project, which was hosted at UVic from 2016 to 2023. And that project was a collaboration between librarians, programmers, and humanists to rethink how we were making digital products and how we were releasing them. I've talked about that, I think in the July webinar earlier this year. So some of this is just a refresher. What the Endings project says about releases is that they should be periodical and carefully planned. The rolling release model should be avoided. Also, a release should be made only when the entire product set is coherent, consistent, and complete, and every page has passed any validation and diagnostic tests that our project sets up. So that means that you don't release an anthology with pages that are forthcoming or in progress or in beta or coming soon. You release when you have a complete site with everything that you want to release done and ready to go. Periodic release also is like an edition of a print work in that each release of a web resource should be clearly identified on every page by its build number and some kind of version number. And I have a slide showing you that right here. This is the footer of the Moemel Mayoral Shows anthology. And at the bottom of the page, if you can see my mouse, this is site version 1.0. That's like the first edition. It was last modified on 2022, 12/22, so December 22nd. And that means that people can cite this first edition as having been published in 2022. And in fact, we use archival URLs for this. So let me just explain what I mean by an archival URL. If you were to go to https://lemdo.uvic.ca/moms, you would see the current version of the site, whether it's the first edition or the second edition. But if you wanted to look specifically at the first edition, there is an archival URL for that, and it's constructed a little differently. Our URL is lemdo.uvic.ca/moms editions /1.0. So that means that when we release a second edition, we're not going to overwrite the first edition. The first edition has its own URL, and it's always going to be on the digital shelf for people to consult. And when we do release a second edition of this Moemel Mayoral Shows anthology, we will indicate that people can go back and look at the first edition at this URL if they want to. Okay. So the citation information that we provide for people actually encourages them to cite this archival URL rather than this public-facing URL. Okay. So if you like, this is sort of the call number of it, but this is the more granular, or this is the shelf in the library where you're going to find it, but this is the precise call number of the book on that shelf. And as you can see, any edition that's published in that first release is going to have its own canonical archival URL as well. This is just a screenshot of an anthology that we've released a number of times. So if you actually go to this URL, classroom_editions, you will see all 3 releases that we've already done, and you can click on those and go back to earlier versions of them. Okay, we can do that because the static websites that we're releasing are really quite lightweight, so there's no reason to take them down after we've released a new version. We can just keep them all on the digital shelf for as long as possible. But as you can see, we wouldn't want to do this if we were updating the site every single day in a rolling release model. So we're really keen that these things that we keep indefinitely be complete and self-contained and ready to go with the material that they've decided to include. Okay, so the $1,000,000 question is when you should release your anthology. And I recognize that everybody who's present at this particular webinar is an editor rather than anthology lead, but we will have anthology leads watching this video later. And I also think that it's a good idea for editors to understand how it works from the anthology lead side as well. So one way to think about it is to plan for a release around a major milestone. So if the anthology lead has decided to showcase the anthology in the digital room at the Shakespeare Association of America, then you could plan to release just before that. A conference event is also a nice time to release the website. You'd certainly want to do it at the end of a funding cycle. And anytime you have a new edition or a partial edition ready for publication. I will say that anthology releases can be motivating to editors. So Christine's nodding. Knowing that if you crack on with your edition, it could be included in the next release can be very motivating. Remember that we have a handshake model of inclusion. So we saw a version of this slide last month when we were talking about what editors need to do in order to get their editions ready for publication. So the editor licenses the edition and all the files therein for your anthology. And then you, as anthology lead, list editions for inclusion or advise LEMDO to include them, right? So this time we're talking about the other side of the handshake. There are some minor milestones that you could also consider, and we're doing this with Digital Renaissance editions right now. We'll release the site without the PDFs and print on demand text so that we have a little extra time to keep working on those. And sometimes you need to make really important corrections. We wouldn't do a release for a minor correction, but if there'd been a really egregious error or failure to give somebody credit for something, you could do what's called a point release. So instead of moving on to your edition 2 of your anthology, you might release a 1.1 anthology. Okay, so let's talk timelines. Just because it's digital does not mean that publishing is any faster than it is in the print world. So first question to ask is this the first release of your anthology ever, or is it a subsequent release? That will make a big difference to the timeline. The first release is going to take at least a year from the time you start thinking about design to the time you can release, because we are building the look and feel of the anthology that you're going to be living with for quite a long time. And so we need to think about design. We need to implement a design. We need to figure out menus. We need to figure out your about pages and put them under the right menus and provide content and encode the content. And then we have the editions that we have to prepare for publication and write release notes. So I would not be planning a first release, in 3 months if you don't have a design yet. That has to be an early part of the process. Subsequently, releases can be a lot faster because you already have a design, you already have menus, you already have about pages. Maybe somebody's rotated off your advisory board and you want to update your advisory board page, but it's a much simpler process than creating all of those pages. In our experience, Navarra's experience, that is at least a 3 month process if everybody's putting their shoulder to the wheel and working on their parts of the release process. Okay, so let's work through an example here. If your desired release date for your anthology is August 15th, then at least 2 months before that, you would inform the LEMDO team that you are hoping to release on August 15th. You might not get that date because we can't always drop everything and work on your anthology exclusively for the next 2 months. But, if it works with our schedule, then we'll do our best to accommodate you. Once we've all agreed that we'll be releasing on a certain date, we enter a pre-freeze period. And during that pre-freeze period, it's an opportunity to finalize all the files. 1 month before the release date, we enter what's called the freeze period. So in this case, on July 15th, we'd be freezing the site. And that means nobody's creating new pages. Nobody's doing major revisions. We're not messing around with menus or design. All that is already done. All we do in that last month is minor changes. So everybody's proofreading, everybody's clicking on links. We're finalizing the metadata, noticing minor things and making sure that they get fixed. So what do you need to do to finalize your files? So this is even before the pre-freeze period. This should be done before you enter the pre-freeze period. And decide which editions and pages to include in the release. And then plan well ahead for peer review. Things still have to be peer reviewed in the digital environment. It's probably even more important to peer review them in the digital environment because some people are still suspicious of digital publication. It takes at least 4 months for review and revisions. These are big editions that have lots of moving parts. A reviewer is going to need some time to go through it all and submit a report. And then in turn, the editor will want time to respond to that. Just a reminder that we put editions into our peer review anthology when they're ready to be peer reviewed so that they are stable and unchanging while the peer reviewer is looking at the material. During the pre-freeze period, the editor can be entering revisions arising from the peer review process, or the anthology lead can be entering the revisions depending on the working relationship between editor and anthology lead. This is a good time to check citations and references again. Ensure that you have made all the links that you want to make between pages in your anthology and to external pages that are stable and permanent enough to warrant linking to. This is also a good time to call for updated bios from contributors if necessary. You can say to them, we're doing a release in 2 months. If you'd like to add anything to your bio, please send it to me by such and such a date. This is also the time to update about pages. So if there have been changes of personnel on the boards, you want to indicate that an edition has been assigned. So it's no longer an open edition available for somebody, or any new funding. During the freeze period, you'll want to make a pre-freeze progress chart, and Navarra will address that topic in 2 weeks. We can give you a template or help you with that if we have a project manager, as we do now. It's not always going to be guaranteed in the future. Proofread pages, standardize the metadata, and you need to clear the diagnostics and write release notes. So I've highlighted those last 2 in red because those are the ones that I want to talk about. 1 week before the release, you should be checking the metadata for every web page, making sure that it's consistent. Proofread to correct every glaring errors. Click every link on each web page, and we generate a list of links, and then somebody, ideally an RA, will click on all those links and make sure they actually go to a live location. And then we change the status of each page to published. And that's a LEMDO team task because we're your publishers. So we change the status of the page to published, and we add a date to that, which is the date that we're planning to release your website. Okay, so let me come back to the 2 things that I highlighted in red. The first is clear diagnostics. What do I mean by that? Diagnostics are some programmatically run checks that we have written. This is copy editing taken to its brilliant and logical conclusion. So what can you look for once you have a computer looking for consistencies? So we have anthology level diagnostics. I showed this image in the webinar a month ago when we were talking about editions. So here's a report on the publication status of the peer review anthology, which is released. You can see it's all green. We didn't release that peer review anthology until we cleared everything, and the status was green on every single item. Digital Renaissance editions we're working on publishing, and so we have some pink things, right? The DRE index is not published. It's not published because we don't know the exact date of release yet, and LEMDO has not yet changed the status to release. Okay. And there are some pages here that are actually in a state where we're not finished. We're not finished our proofing, so we can't really enter that freeze period. the status is IML to TEI proofing. And that means we converted the file from ISE markup language to TEI, but we're still proofing the work. Okay, I'm just going to toggle over to a live demo here. So once you're on the LEMDO dev site, if you know that URL, don't habitually give out to the world, you can click on pre-release status. We have an anthologies tab in our menu. These are all the pre-release sites that we're working on and their pre-release status. So there is that report with all the pink on it. There's another set of diagnostics that people need to check. These are the LEMDO-wide diagnostics. The statistics is always kind of fun to click on. We've got 2014 documents, 241,578 XML IDs, and that just keeps growing. And then some document statistics if you're curious. But this is the part that you really want to look at, these consistency checks. Green is good. Red means there's a little work that needs to be done. So what editors and anthology leads can do is come to this page and do a Control F on the page to search, and then put in the name of the edition that you're working on. So Christine, you're doing Three Lords and Three Ladies of London. Let's try yours. You are very tidy encoder. Only one result shows up. And that is because we're flagging the word old spelling, which is not something you have to worry about with QME. QME's decided to continue with the phrase old spelling. LEMDO's decided to adopt semi-diplomatic. Okay, so if we look up Honest Horror, which is an edition we're hoping to get out soon, you'll see that there are 11 results. And so we have some stray TLN numbers. Those are leftovers from the old ISE encoding. Those have to be fixed. There's an annotation that's pointing to a TLN. There's something wrong with this collation. What's the error message? I'm scrolling up. It'd be hundreds of items here. So we'll try that. But there's something that needs to be looked at there. There's something that needs to be looked at here. Okay, so you get the idea. You know, these errors have to be fixed. We can write new diagnostics. So if there's something that you want us to try to check for dynamically in copy editing, we can write a diagnostic for that. It's really useful. So that's beyond the validation that happens when you're working on your file. Validation's not going to check for spellings that you don't want to use or phrases you don't want to use. Okay, but let the computer do as much copy editing as it can. There we go. I'm sliding that out of the way. But coming back to our slides. This is a slide just explaining what we just did. So search for your play ID using Control F if you're on a PC, or Command F if you're on a Mac. So let's talk about release notes. Release notes is a concept that we've adopted from the software world. If you download a new version of an app on your phone, it will come with release notes saying what bug fixes they've made, what new features they've added, what new content they've added. And we think that an important counterpart to this periodic release model is release notes that tell people how this release of the site, this edition of the site, differs from previous releases. So some of the things that you might include are lists of new materials published in this release, and make links to it from the release notes so that people can go directly from the release notes to the new materials. List any changes, revisions, and corrections to already published material with links. List any changes to the interface and or design. So if there's a new functionality that's been added that you want to draw people's attention to, you can indicate it in the release notes. If the color has changed somehow, that can be pretty discombobulating to people who are used to using a site. So you might just mention that and explain why you made the change. And you also want to give credit to the people who manage the release. Okay, so we're just going to toggle over to the release notes for QME. So here is the live published QME site, a static release of their version 1 site. If we go to the About menu, there's the release notes at the bottom. There's an explanation at the top of what release notes are, with some quotations from the endings principles for release management. And then here are the release notes for QME 2.0. I misspoke when I said 1.0. We called the first LEMDO release of QME 2.0 because it had had a previous life on the ISE platform. All right, and so we've got new material here. We're publishing Kirk Melnikov's edition of Salimus for the first time. Then we have a paragraph indicating the material that we remediated from the old ISE platform. We know that we're not finished things, so anybody who's used to the old site would need to be aware that not everything is done. We're getting close to being able to say it's done. Then there's credit to people who helped with the release. And then finally a sign off. So in this case, I wrote the release notes for the anthology lead to set a model, but in the future they'll probably be writing it themselves. Okay. And there are other ways that you could do this. You could have divisions with headers if you wanted it to be super clear how things were breaking down. Okay, to book or not to book? Should you include the PDF and print version of editions in your release? There are some pros and cons to that, but I'll just before I dive into the pros and cons, I'll just remind you that every LEMDO edition is meant to be published in 3 forms. One is the open access edition that's published with a static release of an anthology. That is the most full version of the edition. It has the textual essay, it has the textual notes, lineation notes, long commentary notes. The edition is also meant to be published in a print on demand version with an ISBN and a nice cover. The print version does not have all of the material that's online. So it doesn't have the textual essay, it doesn't have the textual notes, lineation notes, pedagogical notes or performance notes. It doesn't have the longer commentary notes, and it doesn't have any supplementary materials, but it does have the general introduction, the text, the glosses, and the shorter commentary notes. And then that same print version is also available as a PDF. The PDF can be downloaded into a learning management system. If the learning management system has a tool like Hypothesis built in, then a class can collaboratively annotate that PDF if they want. So what that means is that if you're teaching from a LEMDO text, some of your students can have a print copy in their hand if that's the way they need to interact with the material. Some of them could be working with a PDF that they download or the PDF inside the learning management system. And some of them could be working with the online full edition. But every single one of them has the same text with the same speech numbers and the same glosses. So we've all had the experience where our students will dredge up some 19th century text from the Internet Archive, and others will have purchased the book that you've asked them to and speech numbers are different and the text is different. We're trying to make it possible for people to interact with the edition in the way that is most accessible to them, but not have a different text from everybody else in the classroom. Okay. The PDF and the print book are generated from the same XML as the digital text. Okay. So they're it's called single source publishing, right? So we're taking that XML file that editors encode, and we're using that as a starting point for all of the outputs. So it can be really useful to release the print on demand book at the same time because it offers a second way of proofreading the editions, right? It actually looks like a printed page. In order to correct the print on demand book or the PDF, corrections are made in the XML. So those corrections will actually improve both the digital and the print versions at the same time. It also means that you can advertise the book right away from the edition homepage. You can include a little thumbnail of the cover and encourage people to click on it, and make sure that everybody knows that they've got this other option. I see there's a question from Christine. Is there hang on, it flashed up and then disappeared. Can you read the question, Navara?
I can read it for you, yeah. Is there a character count that equals overlong so I can aim for fewer characters in glosses where possible?
Yeah, it's 222 characters. We experimented a bit, and that seemed to be kind of the sweet spot. Yeah. So, the cons of trying to release your book at the same time as your digital site is that if the notes are longer than 222 characters, we will not print them in the book. During the proofing phase, we actually put in overlong footnote, 243 characters excluded here. So this is the flag that the editor needs to go back and either shorten the note or create two versions of the note, an online only version of the note, which can be long, and then a print only version of the note, which can be a bit shorter. Okay. So Christine, remember that we are only including glosses and commentary notes in the print edition. So any lexical notes, performance notes, pedagogical notes, lineation notes, and textual notes are not subject to that 222 character limit. Okay. If you know that this is going to happen with the print book, you can actually be designating certain commentary notes online only as you go. So you can be thinking about the audience while you're putting this together.
Yeah, that seems pretty useful for me because then I can aim to keep the glosses super short and put additional information in the commentary. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, glosses should be short by definition. They should be, an equivalent of the phrase or word that you're trying to gloss in different words. If you want to point to the OED, put it in a commentary note. If you want to have an extended discussion of what a word means or its etymology, that would be a lexical note, which is automatically excluded from the print edition. Okay, so just recap here. You have learned why LEMDO makes periodic static releases. You have learned that we keep copies of all releases at archival URLs. Okay, we are not like the Bodleian. We do not throw out our first folio and when we get a third folio. You've learned a little bit about how to plan out pre-freeze and freeze periods leading up to your first and subsequent anthology releases. You have learned what release notes are and what to include in them: new material, changed, revised material, notes about changes to interface or design, and credits for the release. And you have learned what to think about when deciding whether or not to publish the PDF and print on demand versions of your editions with the release. For resources, We have an entire documentation chapter on releasing your anthology. So that's chapter 20, and that's published in the lemdo.uvic.ca/lemdo anthology. There's also documentation on how to check your anthology status. So how to see that screen where you get all of the green and pink coloring showing you whether things are ready to go or not. I've also put in a link to the Endings project. Anybody who's working in the digital space should know about the Endings project, and I really encourage you to tell other people about it as well. We've seen so many takedowns of digital resources that we all rely on in the last year or so. As people start to rebuild those things, it would be great if they would build them with Endings principles in mind, right? So most digital products get taken down because the back end presents a vulnerability to the institution. The kinds of websites that the Endings project recommends do not have a back end. And so that removes the vulnerability entirely. Okay, we've made really great time today. The next webinar is Releasing Your Anthology. It's our last 24th webinar, and it's the technical side of the anthology theme that we're pursuing this month. It will be on April 24th at the usual time. There's the registration link. Navarra will guide anthology leads and interested editors through the workflow and technical side of publication. So I will thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for funding this webinar series, Navarra as ever for the slide design, Martin Holmes and myself for TEI customization, and HCMC for site design and hosting.